And good afternoon, good morning, dear members of the ICoCA, dear participants, dear guests. It's a real pleasure for me to be moderating this panel today. We have a fantastic group of speakers to discuss the role of private security companies in migration and detention. And it's actually particularly a pleasure to be discussing this question because as mentioned by Jamie and Frédéric at the ICoCA, one of the added value of the organization, I think, is to look at new trends in private security and unpack the risks, the issues to populations, to individuals, to communities, as well as look at potential solutions, good practices and mitigation measures. And definitely when it comes to discussing migration and detention, since it has been documented actually in the past few years, or started to be documented in the past few years, we have a growing trend of use of private security in such roles, from border management and control to support to immigration, security management, all the way to overall management of detention centers, sometimes including also escorted, deported migrants. So there is a wide array of activities which are being undertaken, being outsourced by states to private security. And it doesn't go without raising questions for security companies who are handling who are providing these services, but also obviously for civilians, migrants, detainees, and especially for vulnerable groups of populations. So really looking forward to unpack these questions today with our speakers and trying to explore together potential ways to mitigate these risks. So in terms of our panel discussion, I will turn to the speakers for a first set of interventions where we're going to specifically focus on the risks and the issues for migrants, for detainees, for communities in relation to the use of private security services in migration and detention. And then in a second set of intervention, I will ask our speakers to focus on good practices, lessons learned, potential solutions from a state perspective, from an industry perspective, but also more broadly in the sector. I'll be also particularly interested, as pointed out earlier, at what's the role of ICoCA in this equation and how ICoCA could potentially support raising standards. Just a couple of housekeeping remarks. As mentioned earlier, the translation is available. Also, our discussion is going to last a little bit less than an hour and a half, an hour and 20 minutes now. We will use the first hour to have the insights of our speakers, and then dear speakers, I'll have the terrible role of being also the timekeeper and making sure that we stick to the agreed times for your interventions so that we have the time to exchange with the room, and really looking forward to the Q&A with the participants who are connected from across the world today. So without further ado, I'll turn to our first panelist, Sorcha MacLeod. Sorcha, welcome. Very nice to have you with us today. Sorcha is a Marie Curie Fellow and Associate Professor at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, and she's an international human rights lawyer with an expertise in business, human rights, and security. And she is well known to the ICoCA. She has an observer status here, and she's also present here today as the chair of the UN Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries. She has particularly interest since many years researching in private military and security industry, and has published widely on this topic. So Sorcha, thank you so much for being with us today. We'd like you to speak first and to give us, to help us actually with a first overview of what the issue is, and sharing, for instance, some of the findings of recent reports that have been published by the Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries. So over to you, Sorcha.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Chair, colleagues and participants in the 2021 ICoCA AGA, I wish we could be together, but maybe next year. It is my great pleasure to be part of this panel discussion on the role of private security companies in migration and detention, and to participate specifically in my capacity as chair of the working group on the use of mercenaries as a means of violating human rights and impeding the rights of peoples to self-determination. I should note at this point that the working group does have a specific mandate from the Human Rights Council that extends beyond mercenaries and includes private military and security companies. And that's the language that I'll be using today. Now, in recent decades, privatized immigration detention has developed in an increasing number of countries of destination. And the working group in 2017 published a thematic report in which it expressed its concerns about the appalling conditions in immigration centres. Migrants, including specific groups of the migrant population, such as unaccompanied children, women and older persons, are often victims of mistreatment by company personnel, manifesting at times in sexual and gender-based violence, death, and solitary confinement. Other concerns raised by the working group at that time included the lack of adequate physical and mental health care of detainees, economic exploitation, restrictions on religious freedom, and obstacles to access to justice and effective remedies. Now, since then, the working group has continued to raise awareness about the role of PMSCs in migration and detention centres. And we've expressed deep concern about the dramatic impact on the human rights of all migrants resulting from the increased use of private military and security services in immigration and also in border management. In our thematic report presented in 2020 during the 45th session of the Human Rights Council, we examined the 4 main categories of services provided in this context. And we identified these as, firstly, the provision of research and technical expertise. Secondly, border security technologies and monitoring services. Thirdly, procedures and conditions of immigration detention, returns and removal. And fourthly, the implementation of externalization policies. The working group established that in many situations, PMSCs are directly responsible for human rights abuses of migrants, including asylum seekers, refugees, and migrant workers, particularly in situations of deprivation of liberty. In other situations, they are complicit in widespread human rights violations and abuse caused by other actors, such as immigration border authorities. These human rights violations often occur through the provision of border security technologies and monitoring services, and are perpetuated through the increasing reliance on technological solutions by states and that these companies provide. Now, in light of these concerns and the human rights violations occurring in the context of outsourcing of services related to immigration and border management, the working group has explicitly called on states to terminate the practice of outsourcing the operation of immigration detention facilities to private military and security companies. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the observed shortcomings in relation to private security facilities, such as are extremely vulnerable in these situations. There are reports of overcrowding and unsanitary conditions in these centres, with limited or in some cases the non-existent possibility for social distancing or self-isolation. The working group and other special procedures mandate holders have called on particular states to urgently use readily available alternatives to detention of migrants held in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. That are specifically detention facilities that are run by private security companies, and to ensure access to healthcare, adequate water and sanitation facilities, and to strengthen measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Persons with disabilities, older persons, pregnant women, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and gender diverse persons are at particular risk of complications should they become infected with COVID-19 due to underlying health conditions or inadequate access to healthcare. Ultimately, it is states that have a duty to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of all people, including migrants, under their jurisdiction, and to ensure that companies respect those rights. States are obliged under international human rights law and other bodies of law to protect the rights of all migrants, including against any form of discrimination. These obligations remain regardless of whether states privatize the delivery of services, including when outsourcing activities involving the use of force and the detention of persons to private actors. States must take urgent measures to fulfill these obligations, including by strengthening the legal and regulatory frameworks applicable to private military and security services. The working group has also called on companies operating in this sector to exercise human rights due diligence to avoid causing, contributing, or becoming directly linked to gross human rights abuses. It urges private military and security companies providing services in immigration and border management to pay particular attention to the risk of human rights violations that their activities may pose, particularly to individuals or groups in vulnerable situations, such as migrants. I'll come back later on, as Beatrice mentioned, to consider some of the recommendations that the working group has made and to offer some potential solutions. I'll also share the link to the 2020 report in the chat for anyone who's interested in following up on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarsha, for this very useful overview, as well as reminding also the normative framework in which these issues take place. After this first overview, with our other panelists, I would like to maybe take us through a different regional perspective of this issue. And starting with Ruth Hopkins, who is an award-winning investigative journalist based in South Africa, but present here in Geneva today, I believe. So yep. Very nice to have you here, Ruth. She's worked as a journalist and editor with the Wits Justice Project in Johannesburg from 2012 to 2018, and producing content about wrongful conviction, lengthy remand detention, and police brutality and other criminal justice issues. She's also the author of the book called Misery Merchants, Life and Death in a Private South African Prison, and also, I believe, one of the founding members of the Private Security Network. So Ruth, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak, and greetings to all members of ICoCA. Yeah, as Beatrice was saying, I work as an investigative journalist, and I used to live in South Africa for 9 years and worked for the Wits Justice Project, which is an organization of investigative journalists looking into the criminal justice system. So I did a lot of work in prisons, a lot of them state-run prisons, and there are 2 privately run prisons in South Africa. And I ended up investigating one of them run by G4S, which is a big British private security contractor that's actually just been sold. And I investigated that prison for 8 years, and yeah, in the end, produced a book about it that I have with me, Misery Merchants, all about what G4S got up to in that prison. And then I also worked on a documentary film, Prison for Profit, that came out end of 2019. And then, as Beatrice was saying, I've also founded the Private Security Network, and that might interest people. It's www.privatesecurity.network. That's the website. And I put together a transnational team of investigative journalists from all over the world who are looking into, in this case, G4S, and what they're getting up to in their country, because I thought it was very important to also expose or highlight the multinational aspect of this private security provider. This session, however, is mainly about migration detention, and my research was mainly around prisons based on criminal law, let's say. But G4S has been involved in migration detention, and actually private migration detention is at the heart of political transformation in South Africa at the moment. people who are familiar with the South African context will immediately recognize the name of the company Bosasa, and they ran the private South African company that I didn't do any research into. So what I'm telling you is just what I've read up on. But Bosasa ran a private migration detention center in South Africa and was incredibly corrupt. And this all came out when a former CEO of the company came out and just revealed spilled all the beans. And that led to a big commission in South Africa, State Capture Commission, because what turned out is that it was incredibly corrupt. That Bosasa and its officials were earning millions off the backs of migrants in South Africa. And there were very close political ties as well. And that's currently, this case is going through the courts. People are being criminally prosecuted. So private migration detention in South Africa has played a huge role in actually in the country itself. But yeah, migration detention, as far as I'm concerned, privatized migration detention is even more problematic than migration detention is in itself. And G4S has, because I've looked into the company, as I said, transnationally, and G4S has also got itself into trouble with migration detention centers. The two most prominent examples are Manus Island, which is an offshore migration detention center run by the Australian state on Papua New Guinea, and G4S was in charge, and massive riots broke out, and if I remember correctly, 77 people got injured and 1 or maybe 2 people died as a result of these riots. And then currently in the UK, the Brook House inquiry is going on, and Brook House Detention Centre was an immigration detention centre in the UK, again run by G4S, and a guard working at the prison had enough, couldn't handle it anymore, and he undercover recorded footage of G4S guards meting out the most horrible abuse, physical abuse, but a lot of psychological abuse, racism, etc. And so they lost the contract. But yeah, I think that is possibly where the problem lies in this field, is that these companies might lose a contract, but then they can bid for a new contract, and therefore very little incentive, I'd say, to in the current framework to improve behavior, you could say. I can go on and on and on, Beatrice, but should I stop?
Thank you so much. We'll get back to you very soon. It was so interesting actually to hear you indeed first describe the trend of securitization of the activity of detention, including for migrants population, but also beyond, as well as looking at how migration detention is indeed in a number of instances a problem in itself. Therefore, the question of the use of private security in migrant detention is actually sort of a complex dual issue, so to say. So thank you very much for this. We'll definitely get back to you in a few minutes, looking more at the potential solutions or good practices. Now I'd like to turn to Asia and to Farhan Kudus to discuss the situation in Bangladesh and in relation to the Myanmar Rohingya crisis. We are absolutely delighted to have Farhan join us today. He came into private security business in 1989, 1990, as he joined the private security company founded by his father in Bangladesh. And after 33 years, he mentioned that the security industry has grown tremendously in his country, all the way to 750,000 people working from or getting their livelihoods from from private security. And as you mentioned, the industry there is rapidly growing, but sadly, the standards and regulatory frameworks are still not close to what they should be. Today, Farhan is the managing director of Securities Limited in Bangladesh, and is also the Secretary General of the Bangladesh Professional Security Services Providers Association. So Farhan, we would love to hear from your experience, including helping us better understand what are the challenges faced by private security companies who are being contracted to deliver security services in this very challenging environment that is, for instance, the Rohingya crisis, or locations such as Cox's Bazar, and as well as understanding from your perspective, what are the key issues that you're trying to tackle. So over to you, Farhan.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. To give you an idea, first I must go through the chronology of the events and how the Rohingyas came to be where they are right now. So in 1977-78, that was the first influx of the Rohingya refugees into Bangladesh. Burmese military junta at the time conducted Operation Dragon King to register and screen foreigners. It was actually an excuse for ethnic cleansing. So during that period, 200,000 Rohingyas fled Burma into Cox's Bazar. The division from Cox's Bazar and Burma, then Rakhine State, is just a narrow river. So cross-border is very, very easy, and 200,000 came over. The second influx was in 1991 and 92. 250,000 refugees flee Burma again, same thing. Then the third wave came in 2017. This time, 890,000 Rohingyas fled into Bangladesh, but the unofficial reports are that 1 million displaced people came over. Now, this was absolutely overwhelming for the country. Bangladesh was burdened with the largest refugee camp in the world. 2018 reports suggest that 70,000 children were born in the camps. And 2021, we expect another 48,000 children born. So roughly in 2021, refugee statistics should be 1.4 million in Cox's Bazar. Now, the question comes on how the locals perceive the Rohingyas in Cox's Bazar. First of all, I think, hats off to our Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, and her government for setting a shining example for the world through her generosity in offering sanctuary. She opened the borders, she took the people in, and you have to remember that Bangladesh is just coming into middle bracket. We've been in poverty for 50 years, 45 years. So we took on this mammoth task of taking care and sustaining the world's largest refugee crisis. The difference between us and the Rohingyas, historically and culturally, the people of the Rakhine in Burma and Chittagong and Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh share the same ethnicity, same language, dialect is also the same. So cross-border trade, migration, cultural integration, cross marriages was the norm for centuries. So they can easily blend in to Bangladeshi society. The sad part is that in 2017, when the refugees were swamped, when they swamped into Bangladesh, the locals went out of their way and helped support, though everybody was overwhelmed, but they did it. But 2021, things are beginning to be a little uneasy. Locals and the refugees' relationship is uneasy, there's tension. And the reason for that is the Rohingya, the refugees have been asked, because Bangladesh has said that we cannot integrate them into our society. So we've been working and negotiating with the Burmese government to take them back, but they show no signs of going back. Instead, they're provided with shelter and food, and now they're infiltrating into the local job market. and they're working for 1/3 the wages that a local would be working. So obviously there is going to be tension and uneasiness. There's also a growing, I won't say resentment, that's too strong a word, but people are wary about, especially the locals in Cox's Bazar, about the intra-rivalry in the camps. Now what's happened, you have 3 sets of influxes. So they're fighting amongst each other. The 2017 people are fighting with the 1978 and 1992 people, the refugees. And the thing is that it's all over what kind of benefits you're getting, what kind of rations you're getting. So there's constant fighting, and if this fighting is within the camps, gunfights, and the astonishing thing is that the government, the military, the police, and the private security, we are very wary and do not get involved. The police, eventually they go in and take care of the situation, but it has an effect on the people. A second problem is the rampant drug trafficking, sex trafficking, and human trafficking that goes on in the camps and around that area. And it's having a social impact on the locals and in Bangladesh in general. The third part is Cox's Bazar is also the host of the largest concentration of United Nations, international donor agencies, and NGOs. So you've got management staff, you've got support staff, logistics staff, all concentrated in this small coastal town. Prices of essentials have gone up, food stuff has gone up, skyrocketed, and locals feel the pinch. So if I say that there is resentment, there is some sort of an uneasiness between the two. When I say challenges for the private security companies, let me explain what the security tiers are. Overall security of Cox's Bazar is under the control of the army. Law enforcement is under the police, and private security companies are mainly engaged by the UN, international donor agencies, and the NGOs. We're doing protection of life, property, and assets. Private security personnel are not authorized to carry guns in Bangladesh. It's against the law. So that's a blessing in disguise. I mean, we do not want to be prepared with firepower, and exactly what Socha was talking about. You all are talking about military security companies and weapons and ammunition. Thank God that we're not a part of that. Our duties are peripheral duties, watch and ward, access control. But the private security guard is actually in the front line between the camps, in the training facilities, of the warehouses, and in the actual camps. So the first line of contact is the private security guard. So with no weapons, no empowerment to obstruct or pacify mass crowds inside the camp, the private security guard has his or her wits and quick judgment as the only form of defense. This is the most difficult challenge that private security faces, to train and deploy men and women who can exercise restraint under pressure, tolerance under provocation, and remain calm but firm when intimidated. It's the private security personnel who are detailed at the gates of the camps, the warehouses, processing centers, transit camps, where any untoward incident can become, they are vulnerable to attack. Though we haven't had any such major escalations, but there's always skirmishes here and there, And thanks to our customers, the organizations who hire us, they realize that we need to have high salaries. So at least the security people who are engaged in camp duties are paid highly, so we can actually go and select educated people. But that helps in the selection process, but training them on issues such as human rights, physical abuse, sexual harassment, awareness of human sex and drug trafficking are subjects that the guards or people have just come across in the last 6 to 7 years, And I'll explain why. I think I might shock a few of you. in the next sentence that I'm going to make, but special training courses with skilled trainers are required to make them understand the implications. In countries such as ours, we have a long history of occupation, colonization, oppression, poverty, inequality, and generation after generation have lived life without as much concern on human rights. What the West defines as a human rights is not what we see in Bangladesh or in this region. And I'm sure that it's the same in a lot of other areas also. In the we select from the rural areas. So we're not selecting people from the metros. So it is a psychologically embedded thing in the people's psyche that if you do something wrong, there will be punishments and consequences. Children are taught from a very young age that if you go wayward, if you're disobedient, you will be beaten. I'm talking about generations before us. The new generation, of course, they become very, very quick with, with the internet and stuff, but that was how generations have grown up. You are beaten. If teachers will cane you if you're not performing academically. In mass crowd control, it's given that law enforcement will apply force to bring some semblance of order. People look at this merely as disciplinary measures, while the Western world would probably say this is violation of human rights. So our job is doubly difficult now because we have to bring these practices. In the last 7 years, we've been constantly bringing this and trying to educate, trying to change the mindset. So once we get the personnel, we get the trainers also and explain to them that, look, this is how it should be done. There's an acceptable norm and there are correct norms that you must follow. So we've trained the guards.
Farhan.
Yes.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm so sorry for interrupting you. It is so interesting. Is there a chance we can get to the other developments that you wanted to share with us in the second set of interventions?
Oh, yes, of course. Sorry,
yeah.
I think.
No, that is so interesting. And thanks so much for indeed highlighting the challenges of being deployed for these private security guards to be deployed in environments which are very, very exposed, very sensitive, while they are themselves not authorized to carry firearms. There are also these cultural differences, these gaps in trainings that you're highlighting. So thank you. I mean, there is a wealth of topics that we'd love to follow up with you in the rest of the conversation.
Sure.
Just to complete this first set of intervention and especially also these regional perspectives, I would like to turn to Daria Davitti. It's such a pleasure to have you today, Daria. And you're gonna tell us a little bit more about the Europe perspective. Professor Daria Davitti is currently an associate professor in public international law at the Lund University in Sweden, and she co-leads the Just Transition project that focuses on sustainability and implementation of European Green Deal. Her research overall and more broadly focuses on the implementation of international law and human rights law in complex contexts, such as situation of armed conflicts, climate breakdown, forced migration, and humanitarian emergency. She's definitely the expert. I was going to say an expert, but I'm saying the expert in terms of what are the challenges linked to the use of private security in migration and detentions, as well as ways forward. So let's look first at the challenges that we have in Europe with you, Daria.
Thanks, Beatrice. You've been very kind, I think overly kind with me. Maybe I will just take 1 minute to, I'm glad to come after Farhan. I think as a professor of public international law, maybe I need to strengthen the point that international human rights obligation on states are actually, on state parties are relevant independently of cultural relativism. And so we need to be maybe a bit careful when we talk about obligation and wishes and desires of other countries. And so be a bit careful about what the obligations are. And so I speak as a lawyer, of course, and so maybe I need to apologize because of that. Then my analysis is always a legal analysis of what the obligation of a state are in particular situation like that of migration. So what we are faced with, and I will refer to the situation in Europe as you asked me, Beatrice. So in Europe, what I have observed through my research on the rise of private military and security companies in the migration context is really clearly an over-reliance and an increased reliance of EU member states in particular. So this is what my research has followed. And of course also of the EU, how the EU is also facilitating this through funds, and over reliance on security providers. And this, it's like Ruth has highlighted, and of course CIVIC have given us a very broad background, not only in the context of detention, but also in the context of deportation, like CIVIC mentioned, but also in the context of dual-use technologies. And this is what we have seen particularly in the Mediterranean. So Italy has deployed, but not only Italy, also other EU member states are increasingly deploying the drones. And so private military security companies are actually gathering the data and transferring the data sometimes to actors like the Libyan Coast Guards or other actors that then proceed and intercept migrants. So what we see is of course, a complex situation in which it's difficult to identify who is responsible legally. And this is exactly what the problem is when you have a non-state actors like private military security company involved in the monitoring of the borders, in this case the Mediterranean. But increasingly we see also I think what's interesting to understand is that of the private sector here, the private industry and the security industry is coming in a context of deterrence, okay? So in a context where the EU is really doing everything that they possibly, EU member states are doing everything they possibly can to deter the arrival of migrants. We see an increase of externalization measure, containment measures, and recently also proposal, for instance, by the Danish government to have offshoring. So basically to have a repetition of what we have seen in Australia also at the borders of Europe. And so this, of course, creates problems and creates a high risk, a heightened risk of gross abuses, of gross human rights abuses, in which private military and security companies are risk being involved. So what I wanted to outline here for you all is the fact that what we see is that the private sector is involved, private security sector is involved in research that frames the refugees as a threat. And then we see the response by the state that is obviously, because of these deterrent policies that I've tried to describe, it's obviously quite happy to engage in acquiring these services to respond to these perceived threats. And then we see also the industry involved in lobbying states. And this has led to an increased securitization of migration in the EU context, of course, but it has also, as I said, led to an increase of gross abuses, like CIVIC has given us a picture of. And so my argument would be that there is really a heightened responsibility on the part of a company, not only on the part of the state. So states, of course, have heightened obligations when it comes to ensuring that in such a high risk context, the protection, like CIVIC says, states remain the primary duty bearers when it comes to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of the migrants. But also we see, in my view, I would argue under the UN Guiding Principle for Business and Human Rights, heightened responsibilities on the part of the private security sectors and the private security providers who want to be involved in this sector. So they're not entering a normal situation. And I think Farhan, if anything, has given us an idea of this, that what they're entering into is a very politicized, a very difficult situation, and a situation that from the start is going to deal with people who are fleeing persecution, and people who are actually in a situation of utmost fragility and vulnerability as a threat. And so the response that the state wants, it's a militarized response. And so the question really, I think, that is very important here to ask is whether, what are the private security providers going to do? How can we provide the right training? I mean, we'll have a major discussion on this, I hope, afterwards. But I think the context is already a context that is not very different, I would say, from what we see in a situation of armed conflict.
Thank you so much, Daria. And I think indeed a lot of convergence between all of your interventions in terms of showing how this is such a trend, Second, a complex question with indeed having populations which are already very much at risk and marginalized, being faced with the situation of migration and potentially detention as well. And also it's a particularly challenging situation for the companies too, who are being faced with these huge risks and their capacity to actually mitigate those risks to detainees and migrants. So thank you so much for to all of you for setting the stage for this conversation. Now we're getting to the second half of this conversation, looking at what are the good practices or the solutions or the lessons learned. So looking really forward, what can we do in order to reduce the risk to migrants and detainees and communities at large being faced with this increased use of private security in migration and detention? So I would like very much to encourage the speakers to look at this from a indeed potentially a normative or legal and regulatory perspective, but also from the practical perspective. And I think Farhan started actually to lay out some of these ideas in relation to training and to addressing some specific challenges, including cultural ones. But also, as I mentioned initially, I'm really curious to hear from you what you think soft law bodies such as the ICoCA, what type of role they can play. Yeah, really looking forward to hearing your inspiring suggestions. So I'll start with you, Sorcha.
Thank you, Beatrice. Just before I get to the recommendations of the working group, I just wanted to correct something that Farhan had said. My remarks in relation to the challenges do not relate only to armed private security. It relates to security. My comments relate to security across the board, so it's much broader than that. But having said that, in terms of the recommendations that the working group has made, migrants without discrimination. And they retain this obligation towards all migrants who fall within their jurisdiction or their effective control. And this would include extraterritorially where applicable. And this is irrespective of whether they have outsourced certain immigration, detention and border control functions to a private actor. Secondly, states should use all tools at their disposal to enforce human rights standards. And that includes, for example, licensing or authorization mechanisms and contracts. Third, states should undertake regular and comprehensive reviews of advanced technologies purchased from and maintained by companies for immigration and border management, with the aim of assessing their human rights compliance. 4, states must publicly disclose detailed and appropriate levels of information on immigration, detention and border control functions outsourced. States should introduce checks and balances to limit undue influence of these companies on national, regional and international policy making on migration governance. And finally, on states must introduce measures to ensure accountability of companies and their personnel for human rights violations and abuses against migrants caused directly or indirectly by their business activities. So if I turn now to companies themselves, companies need to exercise heightened human rights due directly linked to adverse human rights impacts. This due diligence process should take place at all stages of their operations in order to capture potential and actual human rights impacts. Secondly, companies in the sector should be obliged to publicly disclose accessible, clear and non-ambiguous information with regard to their contracts and operations, to the same extent as public entities with similar functions. Third, Where companies identify that they have caused or contributed to adverse human rights impacts, they should fully disclose information pertaining to those impacts and provide or cooperate in their remediation through legitimate processes. In instances in which these impacts amount to human rights violations, they should cooperate with judicial mechanisms. And finally, other stakeholders. Now, as I already said, this would include the International Code of Conduct Association, but also other multi-stakeholder initiatives such as the Multi-Document Forum. And they should evaluate how to overcome current gaps in their founding texts that fail to capture explicitly companies that are providing private military and security services in the context of immigration and border management. Thank you, and I look forward to the further discussions.
Thank you, Zorcha. And I think you already, there's already a question for you in the chat, actually, following up on your last point on the ICoCA and other soft law bodies and the necessity for them to evaluate how they can bridge the gaps that they have today. There's indeed this question on whether the current conversation that we have at the ICoCA in terms of amending the code is relevant to this conversation. So looking forward to the Q&A later on. I will now turn to Ruth to hear from you and from your experience what would be the good practices or the encouraging lessons learned that you have observed from South Africa or elsewhere that you'd like to share with us today.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I think for-profit incarceration should actually be a thing of the past. I think it becomes dangerous when the incarceration of offenders and or the detention of migrants is attached to a profit incentive. And I think that's where a lot of the problems arise, because companies will then try and save money, and that is often focused on labor. And so they try to cut costs on labor, and that again then has a spillover effect and leads to abuse and irregularities. Take South Africa as a case study. In South Africa, the privatization of prisons became a thing post-apartheid in the new democracy. And there was a problem, a massive problem there that actually still exists with prison overcrowding. So at the time, some prisons were up to 300% overcrowded. So the state needed to deal with that because it was leading to all sorts of problems such as TB and violence, etc. And the then Minister for Correctional Services, Sipho Mzimela, he spent time in the States in exile, and he worked as a prison chaplain in a private prison. And so he was very enamored with the idea of privatized prisons, and he was adamant that it was going to save a whole lot of money. It was going to be a better, more technologically advanced prison, and everybody was going to benefit from this. He at the time, and we're talking 1997, 98, he suggested to build 15 privatized prisons. So in no time, the ANC had decided to build 2 privatized prisons. One is Mangung Prison, run by G4S, a British private security company, and the other is Kutama Sintumele, that's run by the American Geo Group. And at the time, this is 2001, these prisons opened. Already in 2002, it became clear that the 2 prisons were completely unaffordable. The National Treasury investigated the rising costs of these prisons. The price per prisoner per day had tripled. And it led to the Department of Correctional Services introducing a recruitment freeze across the whole department. It was costing such a lot of money. So as Stefan Greenberg, an academic, as he has pointed out, the process of privatization has 3 goals: to reduce the national debt, redistribute infrastructure and services, and to improve the efficiency of the economy. And I would say, at least in South Africa, at least in the prisons I've investigated, these goals are not met. The costs of this prison are completely through the roof, and violence is just very commonplace, violence and irregularities. So I think what should be had is a discussion of making detention subject to a profit motive, if that is what we want, if that is a good idea, if that is really cost efficient. Because I think there's also been a study from America released, which says that private prisons generally are more violent and more expensive. So actually, what are we aiming for? So I think that should be discussed. And what's interesting in this respect, personally, I think that the problem lies not in the fact that these are privately run prisons, but it's a profit motive, I think, that in practice leads to a lot of problems. And you could discuss the idea of running prisons by non-profit organizations. And I had a very quick, not a very deep, but a very quick Google search into this issue. And apparently it's only been subject to academic study. I could only find one paper from the Netherlands, which, and in the Netherlands, various prisons are run by non-profits. And apparently they were doing just as good a job as the publicly run prisons. So that was an encouraging study, but I'd say more study is needed and more exploration of that. I'd say that's my main suggestion for good practice. And secondly, if we do want to keep these privately run prisons, then arguably what could also be introduced is contractual improvements. For example, in Australia, where I've also investigated privately run prisons, there's a prison over there, a women's prison, and in the contract, the private security provider is held to ensure that recidivism rates go down. And I think that's an interesting development in terms of privatized prisons. And lastly, I'd say labor laws need to be improved. Private security guards need better conditions that they work under, because I think a lot of the violence incidents in private prisons can be explained by the working conditions and the dissatisfaction among the private security guards. Happy to discuss further.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thanks for introducing this very interesting distinction between private and for-profit and looking at what are the incentives actually which are at play, as well as really interesting ideas on contractual improvements and labor laws, which actually creates a really interesting segue to getting back to Farhan and the situation he's observing in Bangladesh. Farhan, you were mentioning indeed the challenging situation of private security guards deployed in sensitive areas. So over to you to keep exploring some of these challenges as well as ways to improve and to mitigate risk.
Okay, thanks, Beatrice. Well, one thing good about in Bangladesh is the government is very, very straight on its message: tolerance and empathy, and remarkably, the army, the police, the paramilitary, and the private security companies all sort of generally fall into that. You know, they follow that message. We are, of course, guided. Our guidelines come from our contractors, so that the code of conduct is very well spelled out. What we do, and I'll just give you some ideas and explanation of that. If you are in Cox's Bazar, you'd be amazed at the restraint shown by the administration and the military, because, you know, we understand that they're displaced people. So there are going to be wants requirements. So they sit in protests, they'll go to sort of, barricade buildings, warehouses, and everyone shows restraint and tolerance. So nobody wants to get into any sort of a scuffle or a skirmish that could easily be, video clipped and sent viral. So there is that thing. So we do the same thing in our organization. We follow the 4 principles here: empathy, tolerance, restraint, and we focus on monitoring. So our costs have gone up remarkably in the last 5 years because we've increased the number of inspections and number of monitoring. We've also included now electronic devices, WhatsApp and communicative instruments, so that we can keep our guards and get to see what they're doing in each and every shift. So that helps a lot. And I just want to conclude that, considering that there's 1.4 million people in a very densely populated area like Cox's Bazar, but the incidents have not been that many. There have been skirmishes, but nothing that is explosive or has sort of destabilized the region. And for that, I think it's got to be the international donor agencies, the government, as well as the NGOs who are working there. They're making a difference. So far from our side, we're okay. We have not had any problems. I'm hearing what everyone else is talking about. So things are quite different elsewhere in the world. But with the 1.5 million 4 million that we're working with, and we're sustaining here, we haven't had that kind of problem.
Thank you so much, Farhan. It's so interesting. I think it gets back to one of the points that Daria was making earlier, which is indeed the level of risk that is linked to the use of private security companies in this context is also ultimately linked to the very situation they are facing. And in a context, as you were describing, where the overall international community, donors, NGO, the government are collectively committed to support migrants, the situation is certainly very challenging, but maybe a little less prone to abuses, as were mentioned earlier. So thank you so much for sharing this with us, very much appreciated. Daria, you're the last in the row in terms of sharing solutions, good practice. We have a lot actually on our list already, so really looking forward to hearing from you as well.
I think pretty much has been covered, Beatrice, but I think perhaps what I could add, Ruth was talking very much about this idea of not-for-profits, and that what is problematic is the for-profit element. And I would agree in the sense that we need to think that in the context of migration detention, this is administrative detention that we're talking about. It's not criminal detention either. So I find it problematic in all cases. But I think the additional layer that you might want to consider here is that the militarization of it's particularly problematic because these are people fleeing persecution, and also because even in the sense in which the state is allowed to actually detain these people, they should only be detained under administrative powers. We know that this is not always the case, and we know that the conditions are very often actually criminal conditions. So one more reason, Ruth, to say that this should actually be considered seriously. But I would agree that contractual clauses, I mean, being a lawyer, of course, I think of lawyer solution, but I think the contractual clauses should be where we can look at. But also, when we were listening at the very beginning about the annual report on the report by ICoCA, also public procurement. No, from the state side, I think if we look at the European situation, there should be a very close public procurement examination of how states are spending public money actually in this in either detention facility or in spending for refugee containment. But also, I would think from the company's perspective is the idea of also really considering this as a legal compliance issue, because I mean the situation I have described certainly in the European context is very complex and very serious, and is not something that a security company should enter very lightly, because it is a very problematic situation, and the risk of liability also for companies is very, very high. So I think it is important that it's considered as a legal compliance issue with the heightened due diligence that Sorka obviously mentioned already. And of course, labor laws, but that is the baseline, and particularly in Europe, I think there is no reason for complacency. And I think there is no reason to think that there is any innocence here, because what we see are, if we think of the borders with Belarus, if we think of everything, all the external borders of the European Union, I think we need to be very wary of what the context is in which private security providers are coming in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all. This was very inspiring, actually, to hear from all of you these different perspectives and different types of solution. There are already a few questions in the chat, but maybe I'll take my prerogative as moderator to ask the first question. One theme that came out from nearly all of you is how important this issue is linked to the use of technologies, new technologies, high-tech, use of drones, radar, ground sensors, etc. Also use of technologies with regards to everything that's related to supporting identification and biometric data to support immigration enforcement mechanisms. So I would love to hear from you all whether there is also in this regard some areas we should think about in terms of better framing these developments, which evolve very quickly, again, from a state perspective, from an industry perspective. So an open question to all of you. Who would like to take the floor? I may volunteer you, Daria.
I was laughing because I thought, okay, maybe I should just raise my hands. It's like in class. No, I think, so I was thinking in particular when you talked about data sharing, and I think this is increasingly a problem, no? Whether it's biometric data or whether it's data like in the context that I described, when what we have is the data gathered by the service provider through the drone that are then passed to the state, and the state shares them with the Libyan Coast Guard, no? Or that the service provider shares with the Libyan Coast Guard, by order or indication. Because that's the praxis, right? So I think it's very problematic from the perspective of a company, because this is a violation, right? This is a clear violation. This is what the state is doing, but it's doing it by proxy, right? So by actually engaging another actor, so with the Libyan Coast Guard. But what we see is that the service provider that is transferring the data is the enabler. So there is an issue of complicity there. And so legally, and this is what I meant by a legal compliance issue, because the risk of liability here is quite high, depending on, of course, on the specific circumstances of the case. So it's not only the use of drone, but then if we talk about biodata, then of course biometrics, there is also that issue, no? Who owns it? Who looks at it? How do you control it? How do you regulate it? How do you make sure that it's protected? It is very huge. And if we think of the capacity also that some of the security providers might have, that's also incredibly problematic. And I think the COVID pandemic situation has also provided some of this a contextualization to this, on how data have been used and so I think what I wanted to say is that, because it's not always about the villains, right? But I think what I want to say is that migration, I think, shines a light in which what we can really see is that private security providers find themselves in a situation that already frames them as the bad cops, if you want, right? And I know I'm using a very simple language here, but on the other hand, what I was trying to outline before is that there is also a part of complicity from the private sector because of the way in which they have framed migration as a security issue. So having it securitized and having it actually then militarize it the way the whole situation has, particularly in Europe, because this is what I study and I can talk more confidently about, but also in many other situations, in every other border containment situation and border control situation. It is a very difficult situation that needs particular attention, I think.
Thank you so much, Daria. Sorcha?
Thank you. Just to, I think probably just to reinforce some of what Daria said, there's no surprise there, I think, Daria. But I think it's important to remember that the use of new technologies is there and is reinforcing the physical borders. And I think this is a really important point to note. And I think two points, one in relation to drones, and Daria just started touching on that at the end there, that when drones are being used at borders, what we're seeing is that is military tools and military technologies being put into non-military spaces and to essentially to peacetime spaces, and when they're used in relation to migration. In relation to biometrics, I think there's 3 points that we can make in general. One is that when this data is gathered, it's being stored, it's being accessed, it's being cross-referenced, it's being analysed by different actors, and this interoperability of the databases means that the data has been collected for lots of different purposes and by lots of different actors. And so as Daria has already pointed out, we're not talking about the criminal situation as very often, and so what happens when law enforcement has access to these kinds of databases, and there have been allegations that sometimes this data is being used to track, to detain, and even to deport migrants, including children. The second point in relation to the biometric data is that in many countries around the world, there simply is inadequate privacy safeguarding. And so when you have the really personal data being stored, this gives rise to serious concerns about human rights violations. And then I think the third point that I would want to make, and it's one that I think has been made very forcefully by Professor Tendai Chiumi, who's the Special Rapporteur on Racism, and she has written extensively and reported extensively about how the technologies have essentially racist algorithms, and the impacts on those who are surveilled, or those whose biometric data is gathered, how they experience racist impacts as a consequence of that.
Thank you so much for helping us to unpack this complex issue. So we have a question in the chat from Awi, who is asking, government malfunction may not be solved through privatization of prisons, but by increased support for policy advocacy and research. So question is addressed to Ruth, but I think it can potentially also speak to other panelists. Ruth, would you like to jump in?
Yeah. I saw the question. I'm not 100% certain that I've understood it, but I think the problem with my research, which is into privatized prisons in South Africa, and actually also worldwide, I think the problem is not so much government malfunction, but primarily malfunction of multinationals who escape legal accountability. And the government malfunction follows on that. So what I've seen, at least in my research, is that the government covered up for the multinational and covered up the abuse and didn't hold the multinational accountable, whereas there were actually court cases, and the multinational just kind of managed to escape. And the allegations were serious. There was widespread evidence of torture, forced medication with antipsychotic drugs. So people who were not psychotic were getting antipsychotic drugs, turning them into robots. People were getting murdered. People were getting assaulted. It was really serious. And there's been zero accountability. And I think that's the government malfunction. So yeah, can that be solved by increased support for policy advocacy and research? Yes, probably. Probably that's a good route to take. But I think first and foremost, things need to be named and not evaded. You know, that serious human rights violations have taken place in this prison and the government's looked away. That's the malfunction that's going on.
Thank you, Ruth. I think also, if I may jump in, it's a conversation we have regularly also inside the CSO pillar of the ICoCA to try and support better monitoring and documentation so that issues can indeed be identified and addressed, especially in the context of this multi-stakeholder initiative, trying to find solutions at this, concerted way indeed. I would like to turn to you, actually, Farhan, to delve a little bit more into some of the issues and suggestions, actually, that you've highlighted in your remarks. You mentioned that training was one of the key components to change or to influence the behavior of security guards being faced with this, again, very challenging environment. So I wanted to ask you whether you could tell us more in terms of how to make this training the most relevant and the most effective with regards to the challenges that are being faced. And as I'm asking this question to Farhan, I'm also I would like to also address the companies who are present in the room, who may also have good practices or good experience to share in terms of addressing this challenge of the behavior of private security guards being in exposed and sensitive contexts, and how to support them through trainings or other initiatives. So Farhan, over to you, and really looking forward to hear from the members as well.
Yeah, well, a lot of our training curriculum was developed with working with USAID's human trafficking project that was that's still available here, and they're still working in Bangladesh on that. They helped us develop the curriculum, and which we have imparted not only to UN and international donor agencies where we have contracts, but also tried to integrate this into our regular training curriculum. Bangladesh is a big human trafficking hub, so it is relevant, and that's one of the reasons why we've followed up with that. And we've also gone into looking into various other training programs that we get from our projects. We work with a lot of other projects, in drilling, in telecoms, and each company share their kind of code of conduct and what they want, sure, safety, security, as well as the human rights code of conduct. So we work with that. We have a team that sort of decimates this and puts this into a curriculum to use it. But as I said again, it's all good when you've got guards who are going to be doing duty on a remote area. I need to have them monitored. That's our biggest cost now, is monitoring our people on the job and what they're doing, because at the end of the day, you could train as much as you want, but it's the implementation, what they're doing, especially in the camps. The camps can be volatile 1 minute, and the second, next before you know it, something can happen. I'll just share with you the extent of where restraint turns to abuse. So this was a few months back. Our guards were given a new directive by the contractor that all personnel, all refugees have to exit. Whoever wants to exit the camps must do so at a certain time, and then come back at a certain time, and we had to enforce that it was followed. And as I said, people, the refugees are now slowly integrating into the society. They've got jobs and whatnot. So we had an incident where a refugee wanted to get back. He was 45 minutes, an hour late. And our guards did what they had to do. Do not let them in. Do not let him in. But he managed to get in. And they showed restraint, but they was like politely tell him to leave. And the refugee, what he did, there was a female guard right next to him, and he started verbally using sexual slurring, and tainting that female guard. And it was just that snap for a second. The guards just lost it and grabbed the neck of his collar, and then they shoved him out. Unfortunately, there were a group of refugees inside who were waiting for the situation, and they got it on a video clip. The moment they got it on a clip, it was up on WhatsApp and Viber, and within half an hour, I mean, it probably reached the headquarters also, and there was all these questions and investigation that we had to do. And unfortunately, immediately we had to take those 2 security guards and disengage them from any contracting duty. Had to put him in our office and give him some other job. So that's how sensitive things are. Where do you draw the line, right? What is right and what is wrong, and what can happen in a split of a second? So it's important that I keep stressing on that the training part, because that's all we have. There's nothing else I could do. The next guy or the next security guard I bring in, I train him, but what's the chance that he might do the same thing under intimidation or whatever.
Thank you so much. It's such indeed a complex example again, and thanks for highlighting the difficulties but the need actually to monitor in addition to train, and that the challenge is in implementation in addition to preparation of the team. Thanks also for highlighting the perception question in relation to the current environment with social media and exposure to this type of communication. So very interesting intervention once again. We have I think it's going to be probably the last question, but I was trying to see if we can get it translated, because I'm not a Spanish speaker, and I think we have a question that seems to be in Spanish, but from Brazil, on cameras. I don't know if one of our panelists is actually a Spanish speaker and can help with translation, or whether we should simply try and translate it later and send the response to Andre later on.
Beatrice, maybe I can try and answer the question after. Yeah, I will write it down and you can continue if you want.
Okay, thank you so much. Oh yeah, I'm seeing the translation coming in now. In Brazil, some public and private security agencies are using body cameras as a technological tool that has reduced the number of human rights violation and complaints, excellent compliance tools and lessons learned. The cost of this technology is reduced a lot. How do you see this tool? Well, first of all, thanks so much for sharing this really interesting experience with us. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, if I may, we're already doing this on a trial basis on various sites. And yes, it is good, provided that your internet service is good. So, yeah. And that's important because we recently started in the last two years, we started Central Monitoring Station. Obviously, all of you in Europe are very much used to it. It's very common, but for a place like Bangladesh, it was new. And this is one of the systems that we've added to our Central Monitoring Station, where it's remote monitoring and surveillance is helping not only keep our guards on the straight path, but also if there is any other incident and all that, we get to use this, and it's working out pretty good for us.
Well, thanks so much. With this, I'm afraid we'll have to close. So I'll have to thank all our panelists for this incredibly insightful conversation. We've learned a lot on the risks and the impact of the use of private security in migration and detention, but also very much on the types of solutions and ways forward that need to be explored. It came out very clearly that there are a number of avenues to further explore, some of them quite urgent actually for home states and host states with regards to to the use of private security in the migration and detention, as well as for companies in terms of their due diligence practice, giving access also to remedies and having increased practice in terms of transparency. But we've also seen what are the practical elements they can put in place, as we were discussing, monitoring, training, including the very last really interesting lesson learned from Brazil that we just heard. Also really inspiring ideas on looking at challenging the incentives of the sector. Thanks so much for sharing this with us, Ruth. And of course, really comprehensive suggestions and recommendations following the report of the working group on the use of mercenaries. So very insightful conversations. I think it's very inspiring for the ICoCA as well, as we said, in terms of questioning what's our role as an organization and how we can support these efforts. So with this, I would like to close this session. Remind, as Frédéric was mentioning, that we have a couple of more panels coming in this week. We have, I believe, as was mentioned on Wednesday, a really interesting discussion on working conditions in the private security industry. And on Friday, the closing session and panel discussion on rethinking responsible security in the digital area, which I think some of it we have already touched in this panel. So with this, I will just encourage all our members to vote. It's a General Assembly. We have a few voting items lined up for this week, and to contribute to our discussion through the pillar meetings on Tuesday and I believe Tuesday and Thursday. Yeah. So thank you very much to all, and goodbye.